Okay, so we're diving straight into a really significant topic today. It's about the rise in stimulant prescriptions for
Hmm.
kids with ADHD and, well, these concerns that have popped up about a link to psychotic experiences, things like hallucinations or delusions.
Hmm.
And this isn't totally new, right? There's been some chatter, some earlier research hinting at this.
Absolutely. Yeah. The possibility of a connection has been around for a while now. And like you said, it wasn't just speculation. There were actual observational studies out there that seemed to show some kind of relationship.
Exactly. But what we're digging into today is, well, a fresh look. There's this new paper in Pediatrics called Stimulant Medication Use and Risk of Psychotic Experiences.
Yeah.
And what's really interesting here is how hard it tries to figure out if there's a real cause and effect thing happening.
Right.
So our mission, really, is to unpack this study. Does the medication directly cause these experiences? We want to cut through some of the confusion.
Definitely. And we're using this new research, which importantly draws on data from the ABCD study, the Adolescent Brain Cognitive Development Study. That's a huge long-term project, loads of data,
Oh yeah, the ABCD study. Massive.
which gives us a real chance to look at this properly, with a lot more detail than maybe was possible before.
Okay. So before we jump into the specifics of this new study, let's just quickly rewind. What first sparked all this worry? Why did people even start thinking stimulants and psychosis might be connected?
Well, a big part of it was those earlier observational studies you mentioned. They basically looked at groups of kids and saw, okay, are the ones taking stimulants more likely to report these kinds of experiences?
And they found.
Well, one study, for instance, did find a higher percentage reporting these experiences among those on stimulants compared to those not on them. And then back in 2006, the FDA actually put out an alert.
An FDA alert.
What? Yeah, highlighting that these experiences, psychotic symptoms, could happen even at the usual doses, and sometimes in kids without any clear risk factors beforehand. So that, understandably, made people quite concerned.
Right, an FDA alert is definitely a big deal. It would certainly raise a few flags. But you keep saying observational studies. What's the catch there? What do we need to understand about that type of research?
Ah, yes. This gets us to a really crucial concept. It's called confounding by indication.
Confounding by indication.
So think about it like this. Maybe the kids who have more severe ADHD are, well, more likely to get prescribed stimulants in the first place, right?
Sounds more severe symptoms, more likely treatment.
Exactly. But it's also possible that those same kids, perhaps because of that ADHD severity or maybe other underlying issues, are also just more likely to have these kinds of psychotic experiences completely separate from the medication.
Ah, okay. So the study might see a link, but it's not the drug causing it. It's this underlying severity or whatever else is going on.
Precisely. It looks like A causes B, but actually some other factor, C, is causing both A and B. And in fact, some earlier research did show a surprisingly high baseline level of these experiences in young people with ADHD, even before any medication was involved.
Okay, so that's the big challenge those older studies faced. How did this new study try to get around that, this confounding problem?
Right. So this is where it gets quite clever. They use an approach called a target trial emulation framework.
Target trial. Sounds technical.
It does, but the basic idea is pretty neat. They used all this real-world data from the ABCD study, and they tried to use it to simulate or emulate what would have happened in an ideal experiment, like a randomized controlled trial, the gold standard.
Okay, wait. How do you simulate a randomized trial with data where people weren't randomly assigned?
Good question. So what they did was first, they carefully defined who would have been eligible for this hypothetical trial based on their characteristics. Then, using the ABCD data, they employed some pretty sophisticated statistical techniques, things like inverse probability of treatment weighting and standardization.
Oh, fancy math.
Yeah, basically really advanced math. But the goal was to create, statistically, two groups of kids, those who took stimulants and those who didn't, that were as similar as possible in all the important ways before the medication started. Think like demographics, mental health symptoms, severity, everything they could measure.
So they're trying to statistically balance the groups to isolate the effect of just the medication itself.
You got it. Trying to level the playing field, statistically speaking, to get closer to what a randomized trial would tell us about cause and effect.
Okay, so they did all this statistical heavy lifting. What was the bottom line? What did they actually find?
Right, the crucial part. After applying these rigorous methods, trying their best to account for that confounding, They found no evidence that being prescribed stimulant medication actually caused a later increase in psychotic experiences.
No evidence.
Really, that's the main takeaway. The association that had been seen in some earlier, simpler observational studies, it seems to disappear once you account for those underlying differences between the groups.
Wow. Okay, so that's a pretty significant finding. It suggests the link isn't directly causal from the meds.
It strongly suggests that, yes, it points towards those shared underlying factors being the real driver. The things that make a kid more likely to get stimulants might also be the things that make them more prone to these experiences.
So if it's not the medication itself, what were these shared characteristics or factors that the study identified?
Well, the biggest one they found was the severity of the ADHD symptoms themselves. Kids with more significant ADHD symptoms were, as we discussed, more likely to get the medication, but they were also independently more likely to report psychotic experiences down the line.
Okay, so ADHD severity is key. Anything else?
Yes, definitely. Other mental health symptoms were also important, things like symptoms of depression, anxiety, even somatic complaints like headaches or stomach aches, and also symptoms related to oppositional defiant disorder or conduct disorder.
So a broader picture of mental health challenges.
Exactly. And interestingly, other factors like age, parental income, and race also seem to play into this complex mix of characteristics.
That paints a much richer, much more nuanced picture than just stimulants cause psychosis. How does this fit with the previous research then? Why is this study potentially giving us a different answer?
Well, this study has a few key advantages over some of the earlier work. First, the sheer size and diversity of the ABCD cohort is a big plus, a much larger sample.
Right, more data.
And critically, they had detailed information on these kids before any stimulants were prescribed. That's huge, including, importantly, whether they'd already had any of these subclinical psychotic experiences before starting medication.
Ah, so they could account for pre-existing experiences too.
Precisely. And then, as we talked about, the statistical methods were just more advanced, designed specifically to tackle that confounding issue. Taking pre-treatment experiences into account is a really significant improvement.
Okay. And I remember reading they also did something specific about family history of mental illness. Why zoom in on that?
Good point. Yeah, one of those influential earlier studies had specifically suggested the link between stimulants and psychosis might be stronger in kids who had a parent with a history of mental illness.
Okay.
So this new study team did what's called a sensitivity analysis. They essentially reran their analysis, focusing just on that subgroup kids with a parental history.
What did they find there?
Even in that specific group, the main finding held up. They still didn't find convincing evidence that the stimulant medication itself was causing the psychotic experiences. The results were consistent.
That seems pretty robust then. But, no study is absolutely perfect. Were there limitations, things we should keep in mind when we interpret these findings?
Absolutely, and the researchers are upfront about them. It's always important. Firstly, even in a huge study like ABCD, the actual number of kids who ended up being prescribed stimulants during the study period might still limit the statistical precision somewhat.
Okay, sample size within the treated group.
Right. Also, they didn't have detailed data on the cumulative dose or the exact patterns of stimulant use over time for each participant. That's information that could potentially add more nuance, but they didn't have it.
Dose information could be relevant.
It could be. And of course, with any observational study, even one using these fancy emulation techniques, there's always the possibility of residual confounding, meaning there might be some other unmeasured factors influencing both medication use and psychotic experiences that they couldn't account for.
Right, you can only control for what you can measure.
Exactly.
And another really important point, we need to be super clear about what we mean by psychosis here, don't we?
Absolutely crucial. This study looked at psychotic experiences. These are often subclinical, like brief, fleeting hallucinations or unusual thoughts that don't necessarily meet the criteria for a full-blown psychotic disorder, like schizophrenia.
Okay, so experience is not necessarily a diagnosed disorder.
Correct. Now, having these experiences does increase the risk of developing a disorder later on, that's true, but they are distinct. And these experiences can also be linked to other things like depression, anxiety, even suicidal ideation.
Gotcha. So the study is about these experiences, not directly about diagnosed psychotic illness.
Yes, that distinction is really important for interpretation.
Okay, so let's try and, boil this all down. For someone listening, trying to make sense of this, what's the main takeaway message from this deep dive into the new research?
I think the most important takeaway is that this robust study provides pretty compelling evidence challenging the idea that stimulant medication directly causes psychotic experiences in young people with ADHD.
Right.
The link that we saw or thought we saw in earlier studies, it seems much more likely to be explained by those shared underlying factors we talked about, particularly things like the severity of the ADHD itself and other co-occurring mental health symptoms.
So for you listening, especially if this has been a concern, this research offers some reassurance about the medication itself. It suggests the picture is more complex, that the decision to prescribe is often tied up with these pre-existing factors that also independently relate to these experiences.
Exactly. But it's not a reason to sort of relax completely. If anything, it really underscores how vital thorough assessment and continued monitoring are for any young person with ADHD. Clinicians, parents, everyone needs to be looking at the whole child, the full mental health picture, not just the ADHD symptoms in isolation.
Right. It's about understanding the individual child's vulnerabilities and needs more broadly.
Precisely.
So as we wrap this up, maybe here's something to chew on. If it's not the stimulant medication directly causing these experiences, what does that imply about how we understand ADHD itself and maybe its connections to other mental health phenomena? Does it shift our focus? Perhaps it encourages us to look more deeply at the underlying neurobiology or the shared risk factors that might link ADHD with things like anxiety, depression, and yes, even these subclinical psychotic experiences, rather than maybe focusing too narrowly on medication side effects for these specific symptoms.
That's a great point. It pushes us towards a more holistic view of the child's overall mental well-being.
Definitely food for thought.